Let's talk about quality of shadow, because light is balanced by shadow. It's an important way of how we understand volume and space. I'm going to start with this incandescent filament and talk a little bit about the anatomy of a shadow. The incandescent filament, not a compact filament, fairly wide, and so the quality of shadow is not a specifically sharp shadow. I will mention shadows have two major sections. There's the umbra, which is the darker part of the shadow, and the penumbra, which is the lighter part of the shadow where there's some light still filling in. And the penumbra and the umbra, really the penumbra of the shadow is controlled by the width of the light source. So this is not a point source here. This incandescent light doesn't do a great job of rendering the shadows. Let's compare this now with a halogen. Halogens have a much more compact filament, and so we're able to get a lot more light out of them. Also, the quality of shadow is going to be noticeably different. So, looking at my hand now, you'll see that the umbra is really quite pronounced and dark. There's not a lot of penumbra. It's pretty crisp edges between the shadow of my umbra and the wall where there's light cast by this lamp. The only place we really do see some penumbra is the tips of my fingers here. And that's because the orientation of the lamp, the filament in the lamp, is pointing side to side. So if you think about it, any given point along that filament is lighting my hands a little bit differently. One side of the filament is casting my finger over to here, the other side to here. But all of this is in shadow from the full width of the filament. Now, as we move into other light sources that have different shapes, we start to get different distributions of light. We're going to take a quick look at a par 38. A par 38 is called a par 38 because it's 38/8 of an inch in diameter. If I turn this guy on, this wider diameter of light is going to have a direct impact on the way shadows appear. So aiming this at the wall and putting out my hand, you'll see really that the umbra is much thinner. I look like I have little alien fingers there. And the penumbra is much thicker. There's a lot more penumbra shadow around my narrower umbra shadow. And that's because the optic of this light is so wide. Any one point of the par lamp is lighting my hands differently. It's also worth noting that the balance of umbra and penumbra is also controlled by distance between the light source and my shadow. The closer I am to the light source and the further from the walls, the more penumbra I have, because the proportions of light that can bend around my hands are significant. Right now, my fingers are all penumbra. There's really no umbra there. As I get closer to the wall, I'm getting more umbra and there's less penumbra. That has everything to do with again, the geometry, the proportions of this lens and the width of it compared to how far it is to reach my hand. If I went directly up to that wall, my shadows would then be sharp. Let's look at a few other sources. So LED, we've got other form factors. This is a pretty typical under cabinet light. So it's a series of LEDs that are spaced out about every 3 inches. If I aim it at the wall and put my hand out, what do we notice? We notice multiple images, right? There are, each LED, 3 inches apart, is creating a different shadow. And so we have lots and lots of shadows happening. This effect might look kind of cool, but imagine this under a kitchen cabinet if I am chopping sushi with a very sharp knife. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to cut myself. So this spacing is fine for architectural features. Maybe you're lighting the side of a building and you don't care about shadows from moving objects. But for things like under cabinet lighting or jewelry lighting, it's better to think about narrower spacings. This wide spacing on center is what's causing the problem. So here's a different LED, smaller scale, typically used for jewelers lighting. So this LED, each one of these is spaced about 10 millimeters apart, a little less than that even. And the quality of shadow from these is much finer. If I get close enough, you can see there are many, many shadows created, but they're spaced so closely together that you don't see the multiple reflections, multiple shadows the way you did from the other source. I'll add that this also includes an optical lens here. I'm going to insert that lens, and you'll notice that the shadow effects will be blended together. So here we go. I'll push them in. And now the shadow becomes much smoother because that optical film is spreading things out. So these are different ways that we can really control shadow. Now let's say you want to throw a shadow a very, very long way. Really, at that point, the only way you can do that effectively is with a true point source. The most typical ones are our cell phones. So I recommend taking your cell phone with a single LED into a room, turning it on, and if it's dark enough, you can project a sharp shadow, which is 100% umbra, no penumbra, as far away as you can see the LED. It's a great experiment. I recommend you try it on a dark night.